This episode of Q Point Podcast is pre-recorded, produced and sponsored by Quirk, broker at Next Home Experience.
Different views.
I know your story.
From different cues.
Incredible job.
He's David Quirk.
You brought it up.
And she's Corenna Quirk.
Imagine.
This is
Q Point.
Thank you for joining us for part 2 with Jason Joyce, Director of Advocacy at NEFSA, New England Fishermen's Stewardship Association. Let's pivot to the gray zone. For listeners that may not be aware, can you explain what the gray zone is?
The gray zone is an unresolved border on the water between the United States and Canada. The American fishermen were fishing in that area before the Canadians were. And the Canadians have seasons in areas further east of that and southeast. But the American fishermen were fishing in that area before the Canadians were. Since there's been no agreement between the two countries on where the actual border is, the Canadians started a fishery there in which they would permit their boats to come fish in the same area. It's roughly 277 square miles, and the American boats mix with the Canadian boats. So it's an area that really needs similar rules, similar conservation measures, similar conservation methods. It really is something that needs to be resolved because many fishermen in that area, but also fishermen throughout the state and throughout our fisheries resources, DMR, have acknowledged over the years that that is an area where a lot of our breeding lobsters have lived. So that was 277 square miles that when the Canadians opened it up and started fishing, they have no large measure. So an American fisherman will go in there. The largest lobster he can keep is roughly about 5 pounds. It's 5 inches on the carapace, which is the shell on the back. The Canadians have no large measure there. So they can keep anything. So they can keep a 10-pound, a 15-pound lobster, whatever it is, they can keep it. Now, we protect those because that is the building block of our brood stock. Large lobsters produce way more eggs. The survivability of the eggs on large females exceed the survivability of eggs on a small lobster. So it's been protected, but those protections all went out the window when the Canadians started fishing there. And unfortunately, it's been on the back burner as something that needed to be fixed. But I'm hopeful that we'll make some progress on that this year, working through Jared Golden's office. And the Lobstermen's Union has been helpful with this, Virginia Olson. And then, of course, New England Fishermen's Stewardship Association. We have association partners that we're working on with that, with Jared Golden's office. I'm hoping Susan Collins joins us as well as the rest of the delegation. And right now we are exploring various methods of resolving that. And what we feel is a way to find a resolution in this area is joint management of that area between Canadian fishermen and American fishermen, so that we can have similar conservation methods, similar whale protection rules. Right now, American fishermen are not allowed to have any floating rope on the water. So in the water column, when you go along to your buoy and your toggle, which is on the surface, American fishermen have a mixture of sinking and floating. Floating will be further down the warp or the line. It'll be closer to the trap. You have some floating in there because you need some buoyancy because they are in fairly deep water where they're setting their traps. And if you have all sinking right straight to the bottom, that's an awful pressure on the surface buoy. So it will haul under during the tides. The Canadians don't recognize that. So they have floating rope straight to the surface. Now, when we talk about the advantages that ropeless proponents state would be helpful in regards to having on-demand technology. The whales, when they're going along the surface, whether they are just cruising along in a pod or if they're kind of hanging in an area feeding, if you have a lot of what would be vertical line that they might brush by is now horizontal on the surface, that's an entanglement risk. And the Americans recognize that. The way Maine gear is rigged is you have some floating rope. I would guess, just off the top of my head, about a third of the line that we would have in federal waters would be floating and is attached to sinking. That sinking kind of pulls, it has a constant drag on it, just going to bottom. The floating line helps to relieve some of that, but that kind of sets on the bottom. So your lines are pretty vertical. Unfortunately, the Canadians' method is vertical until you get on the surface, and then at slack tide, there's all kinds of rope laying on the surface. and that should be addressed. And it's a problem for both countries when they're fishing around that, because floating rope on the surface is not good for boats either.
What about V-notching? Do both sides practice in V-notching?
Both sides recognize the benefits of V-notching. The American side enforces it. The Canadian side, I have not seen where they actively enforce it. When a Canadian enforcement vessel boards a Canadian fishing vessel, they're looking for safety violations. They're not looking for, do you have lobsters on here that are V-notched? Are you measuring your lobsters? My understanding is they will do that at the dock. But everyone I have talked to within our Department of Marine Resources question how stringent their enforcement is of V-notching up there. Like I said, they recognize the effectiveness because they probably take a lot of hours. But we are very effective on enforcement here in the state. We have a zero tolerance. So if there's any sign of a nick on that flipper, we throw it back. We re-notch it. In regards to the Canadians, I can't say this for sure, but just going from conversations I've had within Department of Marine Resources and Marine Patrol in conversations about this, and also speaking to regulators and other association leaders, it's highly questionable how strict the Canadians are at enforcing their fishermen to notch, and then also enforcing them being able to sell those.
For listeners that may not know what V-notching is, can you just explain what that is?
Yep. V-notching is a practice that Maine has done for decades. And what it is when you pick up a lobster, male or female, they'll have 5 flippers on the tail. The second one from the right, we will put a notch in it, a little V-notch. Years ago, it used to be cut into with a knife before they made little devices to cut that notch. But it's basically you're cutting a V into it to mark it as a female lobster that has been found with eggs. So if you haul a trap up and you pull a lobster out, it's got a notch in it. That shows that someone has caught that lobster in the past and it was a female and she had eggs on her. Now, if the notch is very small, because every time that lobster molts, that notch is going to get smaller and smaller. Eventually, if that lobster isn't re-notched, that notch will molt out and then it could go to market. So by law, Maine lobstermen are supposed to re-notch lobsters where a notch is diminishing away so that it'll go away. The notching law is to mark what we feel are breeding females, and it's a proven sustainability measure that has lasted for decades. And honestly, if the rest of the states and if Canada observed that, we would not be talking about populations of lobster stock going up and down. There is so much benefit that has been proven to notching lobsters, and I just wish other areas within the United States that harvest lobsters were doing it to the extent that Maine is. Maine has zero tolerance. Some areas don't have zero tolerance. Some areas have 1/8 of an inch tolerance now. It was 1/4 of an inch, so there has been some progress made on that federally. But if that was observed and had been observed, the latest stock assessment that was done by the federal government, I'm sure it would have looked better than it looked. It's still fine, but it's a very simple method that Maine has used to make sure that the resource is healthy and strong.
You are listening to Q Point Podcast. I'm Corenna Quirk, co-hosting with my husband, David Quirk, and we are having a conversation with Jason Joyce, Director of Advocacy at NEFSA, New England Fishermen's Stewardship Association.
Now, I know we have different regulations with Canada, but don't we also have different regulations in Massachusetts and New Hampshire?
So Massachusetts and New Hampshire, yes. There are some similarities, but then there are some things that are not similar. A lot of that has to do with federal waters. So there are 7 different areas that are regulated by the feds, and some areas like the Outer Cape, for years were able to keep lobsters of any size and notches, which is unfortunate. But you have the ASMFC, Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission, is a group of states. There are 15 states between Maine and Florida that manage the lobster resource. And they do a stock assessment every 5 years. Unfortunately, there is not the similarity in regulation between these areas that there should be. If there was, things would be a lot better. I recognize as a fisherman, and Maine fishermen recognize that protecting those breeding females is extremely important. And our old commissioner felt that way, I know. I think all the commissioners have felt that way, but our new commissioner, which is Carl Wilson, I think in his role at ASMFC is going to be good. He has a marine biologist background. He understands the importance of protecting those female lobsters by notching them. So I'm hopeful that that concept will move forward more quickly than it has in the past.
How would you describe the relationship right now between fishermen and the Maine Department of Marine Resources?
My relationship with them is good. I think most fishermen recognize that there are people within DMR that are doing the best they can. I think they do a good job at representing our state, but we have ways for fishermen to collaborate with the state and advise DMR on issues of importance. There are 7 lobster zones within the state from Eastport to Kennebunk. I'm in Zone B. You guys have a house in Zone C. Each of these zones have zone councils made up of areas that they represent within that zone. So I represent Swans Island on Zone B. We've probably got 10 or 12 people on our zone represent different areas. So we have quarterly or biannual meetings, maybe 4 times a year. All depends on the situation in each of these zone councils, in which, as a council member, it's important for me to be in contact with the fishermen in my area to know what is important to them, what concerns they have. We bring that to the zone council. We discuss those things. We put things on the agenda that are important to us. The commissioner is usually at those meetings. If not, there is representation there from DMR. Eventually, the concerns of those zone councils go to the Lobster Advisory Council, which is just advisory in nature. But there's representation of dealers on that, as well as several of the zones. I don't believe all of the zones are represented there, but several of the zones are represented there. There is representation from associations, and there is probably the last spot where there is direct advice given to DMR. I'm very optimistic with our DMR. They've been good. I would say as a fisherman, a lot of times our view on things might seem contrary to the department's view, but once conversations happen and you're able to explain the fisherman's point of view, which may be different from DMR's point of view, there is a chance for collaboration there. And even though we don't always agree on everything, for example, right now, we're not really in agreement on shrimp. So the shrimp fishery has been shut down for years now. And as a fisherman and representing fishermen within our association, we feel that there should have been ongoing surveys to determine population levels, abundance of northern Maine shrimp, as well as 2 other species of shrimp that are in the Gulf of Maine. But that has not happened. So we've been in conversations with the department over how we can rectify that and to get some data. Previously, maybe it's because there were other more pressing issues. It was felt by fishermen that that issue right there was ignored, and maybe it was to a certain extent. But I feel that there is movement within the department recognizing that we have to determine if we're going to shut that fishery down, you've got to have proof that there's no shrimp there. So those surveys need to be brought back so we can determine what the abundance is of that fishery. So that would be an example I would give of where maybe conversations haven't been as similar in opinion, but I feel that we are having those conversations and that we can move forward on that. Other areas, most fishermen, as we talked about V-notching, agree with it 100%. So does the department. So NEFSA has been promoting notching. The MLA, Maine Lobster Association, which I was on the board of for 23 years, they have partnered with NEFSA in promoting notching because of the increased sustainability of the fishery by having the next generation of fishermen do what the previous generations have done. In that aspect right there are many things that we have much agreement with the department, and there are other areas where there's room for improvement. One example of the new commissioner's role that he's taking over, Carl Wilson. I've been on the Lobster Advisory Council for a few years now. There has been an issue that many fishermen have been concerned about for a few years, and that is there are various ways when they gather data that's used in the stock assessment, and one of those areas that they gather information on the stock is by setting ventless traps. You can catch a fairly small lobster in that trap. It's like a shrimp mesh. It's a very small mesh, 3-foot traps, I believe, or there might be 40-inch traps. But anyway, the state has a ventless trap program that covers each of the zones, but it's only in state waters. And what we have seen is there are more small lobsters now in deep water than there used to be. But the old way of focusing on up in the bays as an area where most of the small lobsters are at has hurt our stock assessment because there haven't been as many lobsters up in the bays. But it doesn't mean that the abundance of lobsters are down. So on the Lobster Advisory Council, we had been talking for a while relating to the department, our concerns about that, and how could we set ventless traps in federal waters. And it's been a little bit of a conundrum over the way to do that because concerns over adding more vertical lines with whales and all of that. Well, Carl, having the marine biologist background and also dealing with the feds on various things, came up with an idea. He allowed some fishermen that are vetted through the state to tie ventless traps on the end of their trawls in federal waters. And they keep track of those areas. They're able to move the gear around as they normally would. They're given a set of calipers. They're given an iPad. And when they haul those ventless traps up, now they're scientists doing what they already do and observe, but now they're putting pen to paper. They're collecting that data for the state and verifying that what we have seen is true, that a lot of those small lobsters are off in deep water that hasn't been accounted for. So Carl was able to move that through within about 6 months of when he took over as commissioner, which I was impressed with. And I've mentioned this at my zone council meeting and at the LAC. And I think a lot of people who, once they realize the significance of that and how difficult it seemed originally to be able to come up with an idea like that and actually put it into practice, it seemed daunting, but he made it work. And that is an area I would say that gives me hope that relations between fishermen and DMR are going to be even better in the future. I think he's a great fit.
And with those findings, what does that mean for the industry?
That means that the data that is gathered in federal waters that was previously unattainable is now allowed to be put into the federal model to contribute to the 5-year stock assessment. So in each of those zones with the current ventless trap program, that only occurred in state waters, which would maybe take you out to 220 feet of water and then way up in the bays. A lot of those sites where they would set the ventless traps, specifically looking for little lobsters, these sites were picked by a computer program. They're supposed to be completely random, but half of that data collection is up in the bays where there aren't that many lobsters. Yes, there were lobsters there before. I'm not sure what contributed from them moving from up in the bay more to in deeper water, but the fishermen have noticed for a while that a lot of little lobsters are showing up often 300 and 400 feet of water in federal waters. But being federal waters is much more difficult to collect data in that area because you need special federal permits. Not only was Carl able to get fishermen to be able to set the ventless traps in federal waters, but he was also able to allow them to collect that data and apply that to the stock assessment so that it'll be a more accurate reflection of the actual stock of the lobster.
You are listening to Q Point Podcast. I'm Corenna Quirk, co-hosting with my husband, David Quirk, and we are having a conversation with Jason Joyce, Director of Advocacy at NEFSA, New England Fishermen's Stewardship Association. There has been more discussion around lobster hatcheries. Do you see them as part of a long-term solution for the fishery?
Yes, and I think it's been a long time coming. And as a 56-year-old fisherman, I remember my great-grandfather when I was young, but amongst the group of fishermen that I grew up around, hatcheries has always been referred to in a positive manner, and it's a way to basically put something in the bank on the bottom. What you do is you basically have a hatchery set up, and hatcheries have been around for over 100 years. They haven't always been as effective because as a lobster grows, basically when the female carries her eggs, she carries her eggs for about 9 months, and those larval stage lobsters will hatch. They will float to the surface for 7 to 10 days. The majority of those lobsters will die on the surface. The statistic that I've seen online and been given by people like Carl Wilson is less than 0.5% of lobsters that are hatched in the wild will make it to market size. Another statistic, if you keep this in the back of your mind, is that a well-run hatchery that is able to get 4th stage lobsters successfully reared over the course of 2 to 3 weeks from when they hatch out and placed in areas on the bottom away from predators as much as they can, you can increase that 0.5% of survival to market-sized lobsters to 15 to 20%. That's a huge increase. So the advancements that are available there within The hatchery science mostly can be exhibited if anybody wants to take a nice trip down east, down to Beals Island, Maine, and go see Brian Beal at the Down East Institute. He's got a great facility down there. They sort of operate under the auspices of the University of Maine system, but they operate independently, doing various experiments with shellfish, soft-shell clams, mussels, lobsters, scallops, things like that. And Brian has the most experience of anybody here in this state on the effectiveness and how to develop a cost-effective way of producing lobsters that can, in my vision, get those 4-stage lobsters on bottom to increase the stock enhancement. The method that they use is basically the fishermen, they would be permitted. A fisherman's out in the boat, on his traps, comes across a lobster that has eggs on it that are getting ready to hatch. And you can tell when they're getting ready to hatch because you can see the eyeballs shining through the eggs. Have you guys ever seen that before?
I haven't.
I'll send you some pictures. But when a female has eggs that they are getting ready to hatch, if you hold that lobster up in the sun, you can see the sun glistening off of the eyeballs inside of each of those eggs. And you can tell they're ready to burst. And those, at that stage, is when the fishermen would be permitted and asked to bring those into their local hatchery. The hatchery would take it. They would put them in a tank. When those baby lobsters hatched out, they go through a process of trying to keep them separate somewhat. In the early stages, which would be stage 1, 2, and 3, the lobsters would be eating on brine shrimp. Well, they basically are the feed. And those baby lobsters, from my understanding, aren't necessarily chewing on each other. The difficulty is when they hit stage 4 and they start chewing on the neighbors. So when they get to stage 4 is when you want to try to keep those lobsters from having much contact with each other, get them to the bottom, away from areas where the habitat has a lot of cunner, stripers, codfish, anything that might eat it. But the purpose of a hatchery is to remove that first, second, third, going on to the 4-stage lobsters, because those first, second, and third stage lobsters are on the surface of the ocean. A propeller wash going by will kill a bunch. A bunch of little fish, puffins, they'll eat them. On the surface, they're much more vulnerable and less likely to survive. The purpose of the hatchery is to get those lobsters to a point where they stay on bottom and they can tuck away and hide and then start their whole process of growing from there.
Thank you for joining us for part 2 with Jason Joyce, Director of Advocacy at NEFSA. Be sure to tune in to our special edition part 3 with Jason Joyce. You can stream it now at QPointPodcast.com or on your favorite podcast platform.
You've been listening to Q Point.
Follow us at QPointPodcast.com or on your favorite streaming app.
This is where you can get the news from the people who make the news.
Make sure to join us next time.
We hope you tune in.
Q Point Podcast invites guests and candidates from all parties to join the conversation. The views, information, opinions, and comments expressed during this program do not necessarily represent those of the host, Q Point Podcast, associates, affiliates, and CQRE LLC.
Thanks for being a part of the conversation. The most important voices aren't always the loudest ones. They're the voices of everyday people, raising families, running businesses, serving their towns. That's who we want to hear from. Share your ideas with us online, and let's make sure those voices are never left out. Find us on Facebook or on X or at QPointPodcast.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Catch every episode at QPointPodcast.com or wherever you stream. Tune in and tell your friends.